Hello.
Hello. Hello.
How are you doing?
I'm very well, thank you, and
Yeah.
thank you so much for having me.
No, not at all. Thank you for coming. I'm really excited to speak with you. I'm going to address the elephant in the room straight away. I'm quite starstruck, I'm not going to lie. For anyone who can't see, maybe at the back, we're joined by Wallace and Gromit today on stage. It's pretty exciting. This might be a question that immediately shows my ignorance. Are these real models used in animating, or are there, thousands of Wallace bodies around?
No, yeah, these are exactly the ones you see on that screen behind you. Actually, that's a lie, sorry. It's a double lie. That's not the same Wallace. You can see he's wearing a coat up there. And actually, Gromit is on his knees in this. So they're separate puppets, but these are the actual puppets from the film. They're the ones we animate. They're the ones you see in the film.
Amazing. And when they're in front of us now, I mean, it's quite incredible. What do you think, for example, makes Gromit such a great hero? When you see them like this in person, what is it about them that means their personalities have translated so well?
I think it sort of goes back to the beginning, to Nick's first ideas with Wallace and Gromit, and that he created the sort of enduring, everlasting duo of man and dog. And Gromit is there. He's been there for 30 years in all of our sort of experiences, television and film. He's long-suffering. He is such a warm, soft character. I think we can all identify with him at times. He's a great character to work with, and he's a brilliant character for Aardman over the years.
It's also kind of funny to look at them now because they look a little bit like imposters because I'm so used to seeing them moving on screen. And I'm kind of interested to know how you do that quite literally, particularly as, for example, Gromit is silent, there's no dialogue, there's very little almost to animate in terms of there's just eyes and ears. What kind of tricks do you use to bring their personality to life or like direct them?
Yeah, I mean, so stop motion animation, it really physically involves the animator moving these characters around. So we've got clay, the faces are made of clay, and particularly Gromit, his brow, that's the area of all his expression. And I think originally he was going to have a mouth, in fact, and the first shots that Nick started trying to animate, it was really hard to get to reach the mouth, and he realized quite quickly he could do a lot of it just with the brow. And so that's the moment Gromit was born on sort of 30 years ago. The animators that work at Aardman, we train them up and we spend a long time going over all those tiny details, and it's part of my job to sort of cast the animators, a bit like actors. So I work with the directors and we figure out all their strengths. Some people are great at comedy, some are really good at nuance. And those key moments in the film with Gromit, they're the hardest shots. They're the ones that take the most sort of work. So that's where the animators sort of come into their own.
Also, so many of these kind of elements of them that you were just talking about, the fact that they're linked to one animator, that's really interesting because how do you choose which animator gets to work with which character? Is it like a personality thing? Is there quite a lot of competition internally to who gets paired with which character?
Yeah, it is. It's I think everyone wants to work with Wallace and Gromit, and Feathers as well. Let's acknowledge that Feathers was in this, and it was an amazing thing to bring him back. A lot of the animation team had grown up watching Wallace and Gromit, so there is a bit of competition, and we have to be quite strict about it, really, because it has to be the best performance for the film. So it often comes down to not the animator's personality, but their ability to inhabit. It's their ability to act and then translate that into the clay. So it's like there's two elements to it. It's the ability to animate, technically move things at the right pace and speed, but more importantly, it's like how they choose those acting decisions, because the animators are left alone. Once they're animating a shot, it might be days or even weeks that just they are in there with the puppets animating, and then it's at the end of that the directors and I guess myself would see the finished footage. So we can't afford to make any mistakes.
And how many people are able or sort of allowed to work with feathers? I guess he hasn't been on screen since the 90s, right? So I'm guessing that some of these animators had never worked with feathers before. Was there an audition process?
Yeah, I mean, Feather's incredible sort of screen presence on The Wrong Trousers, pretty much animated by one person, which was Steve Box. Nick obviously created the character. Steve Box was the only other animator really working with him. So Steve has gone off to do various things and directed films with Nick. But he was the sort of the pure Feathers animator. And when we came, well, there he is. He's always there watching us. When we started this project, there was one animator, Ian Whitlock, who had worked on that film. He was a prop maker at the time, but he sort of had all these memories about it. So he was our first go-to. And in the end, maybe 7 or 8 animators. The team entirely is about 40, so it can get really big. But we would really trust about 7 or 8 of them with those performance shots. And the animator that did probably the most was Sean Gregory, who animated this scene here, this iconic scene with Feathers and the seal, the breakout.
Feathers stroking the seal was perhaps my favorite moment of this new film. Maybe we can talk a little bit about Vengeance Most Fowl, because, it's been 16 years, hotly anticipated Christmas moment for a lot of people. Why and how did you decide on the story for this film, and how was it kind of decided that this would be enough to bring back these characters? What was sort of left untold?
It's a really good question. It's one of the things that over the years at Aardman, the story is obviously the most important thing, and it's got to be the right time. And these films take a long time to make as well. It's a sort of 5-year process. Nick has endless sketchbooks, and you sort of talk about ideas and inspiration. He's always doodling and drawing these ideas. I think there's some slides as well that show some of his sketches. And so he actually had an idea about a robotic gnome maybe 15 years ago, around the time of Were-Rabbit. He had this idea and he really wanted to do something with it, but wasn't quite sure what. It didn't come back in that film, but quite often all his brilliant ideas, they sort of ruminate around his head. And probably about 6 or 7 years ago, he just finished making a film called Early Man, and he wanted to do another Wallace and Gromit film. And that was the idea he came back to. And it wasn't really until a couple of years into the process that suddenly the idea of bringing Feathers in as the sort of menacing force behind this robotic gnome, it all clicked into place. And as soon as Feathers was mentioned, everyone involved, and at that point it's very small, it's just producers and executives and Nick and Merlin, everything sort of came together. And so then it was just a case of, really, really telling the best version of that story that we could tell.
And technology was a huge part of the film. A huge storyline is the fact that Wallace is inventing these increasingly absurd inventions, much to Gromit's despair. Why is technology kind of such a part of these characters' lives? This man and his dog from Wigan. And what were you trying to say about it in the new film?
I think what Nick loved when he made the first film at film school, his family, his dad was part of the inspiration, I think, because his dad used to make things all the time. So he was trying to come up with these characters at film school. He was at the FTS in London, and he just sort of stumbled across this idea that Wallace would be an inventor. And he would invent a rocket in order to go to the moon because he'd run out of cheese, obviously. But the inventions in that film, I don't think he was always going to be an inventor. It was one of his traits. Over the years, that's become more and more part of the story. And definitely in this film, there was a real sense of, okay, well, how can we develop Wallace and Gromit to a point where we've never really seen that shift quite so much. So in this film, Wallace yeah, the technology really does get in the way of their relationship. And Gromit loves everything organic and natural, and Wallace is getting a bit taken with the tech. And I think it relates to everyone, and it's very good timing because it's so of now. What we love doing at Aardman is making things, crafting stories, making things by hand, and it just sits very well with this sort of form of animation, I guess.
Also, maybe conversation about technology in terms of this new film is quite interesting because I'm aware that maybe like some parts of the film were made using CGI or technology is being used to help this sort of stop motion ethos. How much of the new film is CGI versus, classic stop motion, and where is it handy? Where does it come in useful?
Yeah, stop motion is something that I love and I'm really passionate about, and I don't really know how to do other forms of animation. It's just how I've learned. And I think Nick's the same. A lot of people who've created things at Aardman have been able to do it with their hands. But CGI is an incredible resource, and we've used it at Aardman for years and years, and there's a CG team, there's lots of CG commercials, so it's something that we know and we use quite a lot. The thing about stop motion is you've got to deal with gravity, so the puppets physically, whenever we want to lift them in the air, we've got to have something holding them there. And when we have something holding them there, we have to paint it out afterwards. So
okay, right.
Most of the films, even from Chicken Run, have had some sorts of visual effects to remove wires and rigs. But in this film, water, a massive part of it, fog, fire, things like that, they're really hard to do in stop motion unless you do them in a very stop motion way. Like Fantastic Mr. Fox is a good example of very obviously handcrafted effects. So we use them really to expand the world, and it makes the stop motion world that you see in the film bigger, richer, because we've got vast sort of sky and these visual effects. But there are no CGI characters in the film, so everything animated, every character is animated by a person animating a puppet. But the water, and the interaction with the water and the fog is all CG in afters, but we use a team that work inside the company, so they're in the studio, so they actually come on set and they do topography and they photograph. So it's a very, very sort of well joined up approach, and we never want the visual effects to distract from the film. So we'll always find the best version. Some stuff we shoot for real. There are certain water effects that we do with little drops of glycerin or little pieces of glass. So yeah, we love doing that as well.
That was something I was going to ask. What was water before? Because I've always looked at Wallace and Gromit films like, it looks a bit like water. I know it's not.
I mean, cling film is classically like pouring a cup of tea from a pot is little bits of cling film rolled up. And yeah, like I say, we use glycerin sometimes, and hair gel, stuff like that. Anything that we can control, because the thing is, the animators have to have it there on the puppet. So there's a whole bit where Wallace is in the water, and the animator is actually moving these little droplets of resin around his face just to try and make him look like he's wet.
Wow. Also, I mean, this kind of leads into this conversation. This is a great image of a piece of, it's a sketch, right, of Wallace's garage, and then we see sort of how it's made
Yeah.
in real life behind the scenes. Maybe you can paint a picture of sort of what an average day on set is like at Aardman. How does it differ from a typical film, set?
Yeah.
How many scenes are sort of being animated at once?
Yeah, it's. I mean, this set in particular is a really complicated. It's like a very complex thing to do because of the size of everything. So these are our puppets, and we build them this size so that we can build the set around them a certain size. So if we get much bigger with these, the sets get a lot bigger. We're in a big industrial warehouse in the north of Bristol, and so we have a finite amount of space. We would be shooting 40 to 50 different locations all at the same time in this studio. So we'll have maybe 5 or 6 sequences. It's why quite often there's 2 directors, because we have so much going on. So compared to live action, you'll film, over a series of weeks with lots of cameras and capture different angles and then find it in the edit sometimes. In animation, you essentially make the whole film first as a storyboard, a really accurate storyboard, because when we're shooting, we can't afford to have any mistakes, and we can't really edit it much afterwards. So the edit team, they'll have a few frames, half a second to play with on each shot, and it's just one angle. So every single shot is bespoke. And this scene, I mean, there's amazing lighting and effects going on. Dave Alex Redette, who's the cinematographer, he worked on The Wrong Trousers. He created with Nick that amazing train chase. And that was really pioneering at the time because obviously no one had done it. He said around that time he'd been going through Sheffield and seeing these steelworks, and he was really inspired, and he thought, one day I really want to capture this look, this sort of feeling of it feels crazy and strange, and the shadows and the lights and the sort of fire involved. And so he built this set with all these practical lights. And then the animators, the animator here, Henry, just in there for weeks, animating little Norbots, maybe 5 at a time, because there's about 30 in there. But you couldn't do all of them because, so to give you an idea, we have about 35 animators, and each one of them tries to do 5 seconds a week of finished footage. So, it's a slow burn process. That's really quite fast for us. And thanks. So the average day is the directors all day long walking probably 7 miles around the studio to different units, going in and briefing each animator as if they're an actor. Okay, I've got this shot with Wallace and Gromit. This is what Gromit's thinking, trying to capture the essence. And that's a part of my job as a supervisor, is to make sure that there are 10 different Wallaces being animated at the same time by different animators, and they all have to feel like Wallace. And same with Gromit, same with Feathers. It's a massive team effort. There are so many people, so many talented people that bring it all together. But it's a long day, and it's a year and a half of shooting.
Also, here, actually, we have some footage which shows some of the work that goes into these tiny details of movement. Obviously, we can't see who is animating here, just hands, but what to you makes a good Aardman animator? Are there any kind of values or skills that they really need behind, besides maybe a really steady hand, I'm guessing?
Yeah, it's funny because you have to, as an animator, you have to, so I've talked about performance, that is the most important thing, but you do have to be able to sculpt. You do have to be able to communicate really well with the directors and with the rest of the crew. And you also have to be quite nimble. It's a very physical thing. So you're on this set, you can see the animators are actually in with all the puppets. There's a camera, there's lights. So you've got to be fairly sort of flexible, I guess. Not clumsy, because you don't want to knock things over. That's not good. But maybe not patient, which is what a lot of people think you have to be.
Really? No patience?
I think there are animators that are very impatient, and you will hear that if you're in the studio. You can hear the frustration, because they're making sometimes a movement of Gromit's eyeball, less than 0.5 millimeter in size, and that is quite frustrating if you're doing that for a whole day. Imagine that. Sometimes the puppets break, that's really frustrating, and then the puppet team obviously get frustrated with the animators, and then the production team, there's so many people.
It's a big workplace drama. We've got some departments.
But having said all that, we try and make it a lot of fun, because it's a marathon, not a sprint, so it's like a long-term thing. So there's a lot of teamwork involved, and the animators meeting we would have every week would be a source of entertainment for us quite often.
We've spoken a little bit here now about behind the scenes at Aardman. I'm quite interested in your beginnings there, because if my research is correct, you started out building clay wings for Chicken Run, if that's right, on a summer work placement. What was that like?
It was amazing. So I grew up, watching Morph and Tony Hart on Heartbeat, and I saw The Wrong Trousers, I think when I was about 9, and I just fell in love with animation. So I started writing letters to Aardman, probably around the age of 12.
Not whole CVs at that point.
No, I just really wanted to know how to do it. I was like, I just love this world, miniature things, and I think the thing that appeals is that you can make a film in your bedroom on your table. You know, you're in control of the whole thing, and you can do it. So I was a fan of Aardman, and I really wanted to learn about the process, and I made my own animations and sent them in. And the years went by, and one day they responded, and they just said, yeah, come and visit the studio. So I did that around the age of 14. I was so geeky, you wouldn't believe it. But that's okay in animation. And everyone there was quite geeky too. I got this work experience by pure chance and a lot of luck, you know, just saying, is there anything I can do? And it was a summer job, and it became my summer job through uni. And I'd come back to the college, and everyone would be like, so what was it like at Aardman? And I'd talk about the things I learned. And it was, when I finally finished my degree and went to work at Aardman, it was like being at sort of another uni, because everyone there is so, you know, into what they do. No one wears a suit. It's very creative. It's like a messy, you wouldn't believe it if you saw it. It's not very slick. It's just very handmade, and I love that.
The houses in this shot actually are really interesting, because Aardman has been animating and creating the same house in Wigan, Wallace Gromit's house in Wigan, for decades. Has anything changed about the house, and what references are you looking in terms of interior design? Where are you pulling from?
Well, again, a lot of it stems from Nick's memories of childhood and his grandparents' house and Preston and Lancashire area. I've got to say, you know, Matt Perry, who's the production designer, he is incredible, sort of leading this team of maybe 50 set dressers, and we pretty much have the same house. He's had the same house in all the films, but it always gets a little bit of artworking, you know, fresh liquor paint on the bricks. Yeah. It's a very textural world. I think that's what makes Wallace and Gromit feel incredible, because it feels like a real world. And maybe that's what makes it so funny as well, because you sort of go along with it. You're like, yeah, okay, I believe this is a real place. And then suddenly you've got a penguin who's in charge of a heist suddenly in the middle of this quite realistic world. So it's, yeah.
Let's talk a little bit about feathers again, because, I feel like at this point a fairly huge menacing presence, I guess, in animation. And even less than maybe like Gromit, there's less on the face to animate, it seems like. How do you make him look evil? Yes.
The brilliant design, that pure simplicity. Of course, I had to bring feathers tonight. So he's right here. Here he is.
Oh my gosh.
Pure evil.
Yeah. It's terrifying.
Yeah.
The eyes, even now, are glinting in a distressing way.
Yes.
What are the eyes made of?
They are glass pins. They're just pins with glass on the end, glass-headed pins. The funny thing is they're incredibly menacing on the big screen. I mean, these are the puppets. This is what you see in those shots. And you're right, he's got so little to emote through. There's no brow, there's no ears. It's like, on one hand, it's an animator's nightmare because there's so little to go on. On the other hand, it's sort of liberating when you're forced to like distill a whole performance down into the move of a head. And obviously a lot of work goes into the composition of the shots, the music. You know, Nick would talk about a sort of slow push in. It does a lot if a character isn't moving, but you project so much into his head. into Feathers' mind. The animators that work with him, we literally had to sort of say, okay, he's not going to blink in this shot. He's only going to blink when something's going on that requires him to blink. And for an animator, that's hard. You know, you might be animating for 5 hours and you'd be like, I should probably do something now. Got to give him something. But they're like, no blinking, not on this shot. The pins themselves are bought by the 100 and they're all handmade. So the poor model making team, they go through with a pair of tiny measuring devices to measure each one until they find 2 that match. We're talking like 1/10 of a millimeter, but it makes a huge difference if they're different.
Also, this links into another kind of real interest point of mine, which is Aardman is not traditionally cutesy, and it must be kind of hard to strike that balance or pull away from, you know, being cute, unquote. And you're really good at suspense and making things actually kind of scary in some instances. How do you create that suspense? Also, especially if we've heard about the fact that people are working on, you know, scenes for days, weeks. How do you keep things suspenseful in that time?
I mean, so there's various layers to it, I suppose, but obviously the edit, the sound, all of that, it does a lot for us. There's so much focus, you know, if you're animating stop motion, you've really got to focus on the microsecond, and suspense, it's about timing. So the animation team, you know, we talk a lot about timing and we analyze timing for everything. But the suspense builds up because of the context, and that's because of the brilliant storytelling, and that's the writers, the directors, the cinematographers. You know, all of that really builds that suspense. And the cutesy thing is interesting because it's like these look like simple shapes, but when you start analyzing how Feathers or Gromit's head is actually put together, it's incredibly cleverly complex. You know, it looks simple, but there's so much nuance to it. So I think that really is just Nick has an incredible way of designing characters that make them look very appealing. A lot of it's in the eyes, obviously, those sort of googly eyes, but he creates these characters that, yeah, they translate around the world amazingly well to different countries because I don't know why. I don't know why. People see something in them, you know, that they can identify with.
Also today, something that we've spoken a lot about is, you know, just how tiny some of these, you know, actions are, the fact that, you know, these pins on the eyes, how small these motions are. You have also kind of alluded to the fact that, like, anyone animators have bad days and there are mistakes. What does a mistake or a challenge look like at Aardman? What kind of sets a scene back?
Yeah, lots and lots of there's so many things that can go wrong, but we try and plan everything. So, I mean, the biggest thing, obviously, is the performance direction. We spend a lot of time planning that, and the directors act everything out. So there are some hilarious bits of video footage here and there. You know, I'm thinking Nick Park dressed as a nun, stuff like that. But we try and eliminate those kind of performance mistakes early on. But the puppets breaking, it's always at the worst possible time. You know, occasionally we drop them on the floor. That's not good. Their heads come off and fall out. You know, the eyes, the lids, Feathers' eyelids are tiny. And so
Feathers has eyelids.
He's got eyelids, yeah. And they're not just, I mean, if you watch the time lapse, I don't know if we've ever caught any of the animators trying to balance an eyelid on Feathers, but it's incredibly frustrating. And so one of them even built a little net underneath the set just to try and catch it, save them from looking for hours on the floor. What else? I mean, sometimes we have a flood. We've had a couple of floods. We've had plagues, floods, lighting, you know, if there's a thunderstorm or the lights go out, there can be things like that just no one's expecting. Once I had a piece of set, it wasn't on this film, but on a set that was very beautifully made on the Pirates movie, and I noticed some reflections in some glass. There was a cabinet full of glass jars, and I sort of noticed this reflection moving, and all of them moving, and I was thinking, that's weird, I'm not animating that. Why is that moving? And I realised the whole thing was just slowly peeling off the wall at the back, and it had been stuck on with blue tack, which is not something we normally do, but you do it when you're setting up a shot, and you're like, okay, is that the right place, before you fix it all. And so there's things like that you just think, if this falls off now, I've lost a week's work, and I go back to the start of a week ago. So it's literally like being on a Friday going, everything I've just done, I'm going to start again. But that's part of the challenge as well, and the fun. Keeps us on our toes.
I mean, you also get the sense that, I mean, despite however many, new uses of CGI, it's still sometimes held together with blue tack, which is lovely.
Yeah.
I think also there's some images here, yeah, exactly, of the first Wallace and Gromit animation, Grand Day Out. And as we're talking here about sort of how some of those changes have happened to production, it still feels like the heart of it is there, definitely. I guess these characters also have lasted so long, they've resonated so well. Why do you think that is? What about Nick Park's creations have really had this staying power? That's a great one.
Yeah, it's such a good question, because it's not something you can, there's no formula to it. I think that's the thing, they're so unique, and his take on the world is so brilliantly unique. Comedy is surely a massive part of it, because we all love comedy, and when something's just pure fun to watch, you enjoy it, you enjoy being with them, and you want to see more of them. And throughout that comedy that Aardman has built its name on, arguably, on over so many projects, so many different characters, that comedy is universal quite often, even though it's very specific to Nick or to Pete, whoever's made the characters. But there's also emotion at the heart of it. Like, there's a real pure emotion, and it's just such a lovely thing. Whether that's the love between Wallace and Gromit, or it's the fear between them and Feathers, or all of those emotions, we just love seeing them. We connect with them on screen, I think.
That's so nice. We have quite a few questions from the audience, so I'm going to try and get to some of them now, because, people are keen to talk about it. One of my favorite ones is, will Wallace and Gromit ever be in Fortnite? I don't know if that's top secret information.
Yeah, not to my knowledge, but I don't know. Never say never, but lots of people want to work with Wallace and Gromit, and lots of people want to have them in their worlds, and I get that. I like them to see them all over the place.
Maybe one that's a bit more tangible is, what is the most difficult shot you animated in Vengeance Most Fowl? That's from Ted.
Okay, that's a good question. I was a supervisor, so I was lucky enough to see some of the hardest shots in the film being animated by someone else. That was nice for me. I think one of the hardest shots in the film, there's a couple. So one of the shots I did a little sequence at the end of the film, and I was really keen to do that, because as an animator and a fan, I just wanted to have a tangible thing. And it was Wallace patting Gromit on the head, and I've animated that a couple of times actually, but never in this way. So what he does right at the end is he sort of rubs his hands.
It's a vicious pat, I remember it.
Well, so I've done a couple of vicious pats, but this was like a loving sort of pat to a dog. And what made it really difficult is that Wallace has really big hands and Gromit has really massive ears, and the two things don't really fit together. So there was a lot of sculpting. That was hard, but actually it was a really lovely moment as well. So it was a really special thing to do. But I think some of the hardest stuff, actually, Feathers, that little seal that you saw that Nick named Ron, he was tiny, that seal, Ron the seal, Ron seal. He was tiny, and Sean, the animator, had to somehow, I don't know how he did this, animate Ron looking slightly sad when Feathers left him. Bearing in mind he's made of fur, felt, there's no clay there, so he somehow needle felted during the shot to make this tiny little, I just don't know how he did it, but I love that.
Another one from Charlie, which is, how significant has your non-London location been in the story and success of the studio?
I think not being in London has allowed Aardman to work with lots of different people. Because animation involves being inside a big dark box, basically, you don't get to enjoy the view. So being somewhere like London doesn't make a huge difference. I think space-wise, Bristol was a good call for them, and it's got bigger over the years, but it really did just start with Pete and Dave, on a tabletop. Now it's a huge studio, and Bristol actually has such a massive creative scene, so it's a really lovely. Aardman's obviously a very big part of the city. Partly because of the Gromit trails and the Wallace trails, and all the sort of external physical things that exist in the real world with these characters. But they're very proud to be British, but also to be Bristol-based. And they're international. Aardman's had the fortune to work with people all over the world, and obviously make feature films that have been funded by the States quite often, but now Netflix, which takes them everywhere.
Amazing. I actually think we only have time for one more question. And I'm going to steal the slot for that question because I'm quite interested in hearing about, out of all of your work at Aardman since the 90s, you just mentioned how special that scene was of the very loving Pat. But is there another scene that whenever you watch it or rewatch it that really sticks out to you, either because it was a triumph or because it was so frustrating that you can't forget it?
It's very hard for, I think, all of the crew, when you watch the film, you look for the bits you've been involved with, and quite often you wish you'd done them a bit differently. So that is like a common thread, and it's hard to watch the films. And maybe 2 years after the film's finished, you can watch it and go, no, I can see it now as a film. So I've got those shots in my career that have been really difficult, I've tended to sort of forget about because I'm quite an optimist, and somehow I've managed to sort of block that out. If you focused on those bits, I think it'd be really hard because it's such a challenging job to do. And I was thinking, I love all the things I've done with Wallace and Gromit is probably my favorite character to animate. But I think I instantly, in my career, I jumped to the moment where I was first really given the lead role, and that was on Pirates. And I think it was because Pete and Dave, who set up the company, Pete directed Pirates. I'd already worked with Nick a lot, and he trusted me with the main character. And for me, that was it was massively stressful doing the first shot in the film with the first main character. And it was a complex shot with the pirate captain dipping a biscuit in a cup of tea, very English thing to do, custard cream it was, and he was dipping this biscuit, and so it had a bit of everything. It had timing, comedy, character, it had some effects, because I had to animate the tea on a little pin and wax and stuff, and this big camera move, and I just remember thinking, oh my God, I can't believe I'm doing this, and when that shot was finished and it was approved, pretty much the whole crew went to the viewing theatre and we all watched it. I mean, it was 200 people, and Pete was there saying, this is the first film, and I think I can't really, I can't get over that still.
That's perfect. Dipping biscuit in tea, amazing. That's a good Aardman way to finish. Okay, thank you so much for your time today. We have a wonderful round of applause for Will Becher.
Thank you. Oh.